Well, thanks very much, everybody. I think most folks are back in the room. So in the interest of time, we're going to get going here with the first panel discussion for the day. And just to give everybody a heads up, the intent today is we're going to have a moderated discussion here, but save time for questions from you folks in the audience towards the back 15 minutes or so. And the aim of the panel today is to examine the current state of military deterrence against China across the Taiwan Strait, and discuss steps that can be taken by the United States and its allies and partners, including Canada, to bolster deterrence, counter Beijing's use of gray zone tactics against Taipei, and contribute to the peace and stability of the Taiwan Straits. And joining me up on stage to do that today are four very distinguished speakers and panelists. To my immediate left is retired Ambassador Stephen Young, who, amongst many other things in a long foreign service career, was the director of the American Institute in Taiwan, as well as Consul General in Hong Kong. And while he now lives in New Hampshire, has previously lived in Taiwan 5 times, I believe. Yes. Next to him is Russell Hsiao, who is the executive director of the Global Taiwan Institute, one of the partners for today. So thank you for the help putting this on. Next to him, Eric Chan, who is, and as he says in his day job, he's a senior strategist of the U.S. Air Force, and apparently has time to have a not day job too on top of that, including his capacity as a non-resident research fellow of the Global Taiwan Institute. And last but not least, on the end of the podium up here today is retired Rear-Admiral Brian Santarpia, who's most recently the former commander of Maritime Forces Atlantic for the Royal Canadian Navy, in addition to a bunch of other cross-hatted positions that come with that. And prior to that, Brian was the Chief of Staff to the Canadian Joint Operations Command. So about as much operationally focused experience with the region as one can get in the Canadian military. To start the conversation off, and Stephen, I'm going to come to you first. Give us a bit of a laydown of how you see the security landscape in the Indo-Pacific evolving, and how you would characterize the security situation that impacts Taiwan specifically today.
Thank you very much, David. and it's very good to be here in Canada on a beautiful day here. It's a little tempting to go out for a walk, but I guess I'll save that for later on in the day. I'm going to begin with something about my name, Stephen M. Young. Back in the 1980s, I was working in the State Department, living in Taiwan, in Washington, and I got a strange call out of the blue, asking or expressing condolences on my death. Well, it turns out there was an Ohio senator who had Stephen M. Young as his name, and he had just died. So I fielded these calls and said, "This is not the right guy. I'm not dead yet." But I also took some ribbing when I went through San Francisco years ago, when the quarterback there was a guy named Steve Young. And I remember I showed my passport to some guy, and he looked at it and said, "You're over the hill." And I said, "That's the other guy. It's not me." You got to be careful when the customs officer accosts you, because you want him to just let you in. Anyway, it's really a pleasure to be here and to talk to my many friends about an island that I love very much, having lived there 5 times over a 50-year period and watched it emerge from third world country status to a thriving economy. And you're all carrying a piece of Taiwan in your pocket because they're the foremost manufacturer of high-end chips, TSMC and other companies. So many people don't realize, but that if you want the best chips, you go to Taiwan. So the subject matter is the security landscape in Indo-Pacific and how we would characterize that and what it means for Taiwan. Xi Jinping, of course, has ratcheted up the rhetoric and his activities recently, and both his behavior for Hong Kong, which is just abominable and breaks solemn commitments to the British and the world. This guy is not my favorite thug. And he's got competition in Moscow. But I think despite the lack of diplomatic relations, U.S. relations with Taiwan have been very, very solid, with a tremendous amount of support by our Congress. And the Taiwans very wisely have courted a whole phalanx of representatives and senators on both sides of the aisle to have a U.S. Congress that, despite the majority party or whatever, has always been very supportive of Taiwan. And that, particularly after the loss of formal diplomatic relations, has been a very important pillar of U.S.-Taiwan relations. Yet Taiwan is living in dangerous times. I was a Russia-China guy, so I watch how Putin has brazenly invaded a neighboring country. And I think it sends a signal to the PRC that they should be very cautious about anticipating any such action across the turbulent Taiwan Straits, and with the implicit understanding that the United States will not stand by if China attacks Taiwan. I'm also struck that the Japanese have become much more vocal recently on this subject. And you might know that Japan, despite colonizing Taiwan for 50 years, 1895 to 1945, left a very positive image on the island. And in my travels, I was struck by all the older people, including Li Donghui, whose first language was Taiwanese, and who really carried the banner of Taiwan's sovereignty and important place in the region and in the world. So I think that despite Xi Jinping's talk, and he says he wants to stay in office for a long time, and I hope he does, because he wants to solve the Taiwan issue before he dies, and maybe he'll live forever and we'll all be lucky. I also am struck by the aggression China has pursued in the South China Sea, occupying islands and so forth, despite a decision by the relevant international organization saying that it was Taiwan territory. So Taiwan lives in the shadow of a very aggressive and far from free neighbor that claims to have the right to extinguish their survival. I also want to talk about Taiwan's relationship with Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. One thing that really strikes me is that China does not have any friends in Asia. They're really good, except for North Korea. They're really good at alienating countries around the world with bogus territorial claims and aggressive naval activities. I think they just rammed a Philippine ship in Philippine water. They need to go to etiquette school, I think, these guys. I've been hoping for a more open China for a long time, and I still have hope for it. I'm not quite ready to go to my maker, but it sure does seem like with Xi Jinping in power, there's not much hope at this point, despite the incredible success story Taiwan has has generated. And I think if you look at East Asia, China really doesn't have many friends. Japan doesn't like them. The Philippines are upset about their bogus territorial claims. Indonesia and Vietnam. China just seems to go out of its way to alienate people. When we were back in 5th grade, there was that kid in school that would just always piss you off. And you just think China must have gone to the same schooling because that's what they do so well. Anyway, I also spent a lot of time both in Washington and in Moscow dealing with U.S. relations with that country. You know, it makes me so sad to see this invasion of Ukraine and the fact that Putin calls them neo-Nazis. If you read any history, the Ukrainians were the most sorely punished by the Nazi invasion in 1941-42. I've been to Baba Yar, where 33,000 Jews were marched out and massacred in a couple of days once the Nazis came in. And for Putin to call the Ukrainians neo-Nazis is not only wrong, it's just sinister. I don't know what he drinks for his I don't know about that guy. Anyway, I am looking forward to the next election of Taiwan. I know it will be closely watched by many parties, and there'll probably be delegations from our country to go and observe. And Taiwan, which was an authoritarian one-state country or non-country when I lived there as a boy, has now developed into one of the most flourishing democracies in East Asia. It's something that we can all be proud of. I will tell you, I'm a little nervous about our next election because one guy gets Taiwan and the other one doesn't. And if Mr. Trump gets back into power, I fear that he would be willing to tell China, you can have it, you know, give me something and you can have it. And yet the rest of East Asia disagrees with that, and I think Taiwan has many friends in this room and all around the world that would object to that. And President Biden, to his credit, has been a little bit more blunt than others, saying, yeah, if the Chinese attack Taiwan, we'll get involved. So they got to think long and hard about that. And Taiwan's a wonderful place. As I've said, it makes the most advanced chips in the world. It's a thriving democracy. They've had changes of government both ways, which is a sign of a maturing democracy. And it just leaves an awful lot for all of us to be proud of. Anyway, the question now is the security landscape in the Indo-Pacific and the stability of the region. I think the Taiwan Strait is a critical element in all that. And I think the commitment of the United States and other friends in East Asia should give Mr. Xi real caution about launching a naval attack on Taiwan. If he just wants to destroy the island, he can send a lot of missiles, but what is he going to get then? Anyway, I'm not a big fan of this guy, if you can't guess that. Anyway, he speaks in broad statements of historical trends, but in reality, he seems bent on resolving to his satisfaction the reincorporation into Greater China of an island that would have to follow in the sad footsteps of Hong Kong, where I served as Consul General, but it's gone. Hong Kong's gone. Despite Deng Xiaoping's promises, Xi Jinping has turned it into another part of China. And the people of Taiwan were never very anxious to be a part of China, but that gives them another argument that anything you hear from the Chinese is unreliable. But anyway, let's hope that it never comes to that, but I do believe the United States and many other countries would come to Taiwan's assistance if they were threatened.
And I'm going to come back to you on that point specifically and ask you to build a little bit on some of the U.S. electoral outlooks, given what you sort of teased there in a minute.
Sure.
But if I can go to Eric and get you to talk a little bit. So Stephen introduced some of the changes in the trajectory with China. Eric, can you give some perspective about some of those security defense posture evolutions and specifically the impacts as they pertain to the security situation around Taiwan?
Sure. So I think the way to best frame this problem is to think about it in terms of continuity versus change, with one essential exception to this. Think of the three core missions of the People's Liberation Army, right? The very first core mission is to protect the CCP, and the new one is to protect the core leader of the CCP. The second one is to compel Taiwan to political unification. And that is the crucial change, because it used to be simply deter Taiwan from independence. Now it's changed to compel, and that has a new set of strategies to deal with this type of change in behavior. And the third one is deter and, if necessary, defeat the so-called strong enemy, which is the way that the PLA refers to the U.S. as well as the U.S. allies and partner network. Taken together, there's a lot of continuity here, but that one change into compellence has driven a lot of the way the PLA deals with Taiwan and the United States. A good example of this, in 1996, when they were dealing with the second Taiwan Strait crisis, what they did was to simply fire missiles, right? They killed a lot of fish, didn't do much other than to show that symbolic show of force, right? But now with their responses to Speaker Pelosi, as well as Speaker McCarthy, as well as Vice President Li's transit through the U.S., what we've noticed is that they've been taking parts of coercion operations and operationalizing them. These are actions that they would take during wartime to either institute a blockade and to test out U.S. as well as allied and partner responses. So things have become deadly serious for the People's Liberation Army. Right, and a lot of this has to do with their leadership, of course. The one thing that General Secretary Xi has mentioned in every single speech in almost his entire time in power has been to encourage the CCP to take more risks. That's the one thing that he harps on year after year, is to encourage the party to take more risks, to be able to challenge the United States and to be able to achieve unification. So when we see the type of deadly operational dangers that the PLA is undertaking in places like the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Straits, these aren't accidents. These are things that were ordered by their political and their military leadership. So dealing with this type of much more dangerous and ideological risk-taking on part of the PLA, which is not a national army, but instead the last final guarantor of the CCP political power. That's something that's daunting for the U.S. And over the last few years, we've had to be able to deal with this in a much more different way than in the past.
Russell, I'm going to come to you next and ask you to build on sort of the scene that Ambassador Young was setting there about some of the regional dynamics. So to flesh that out a little bit, how would you observe different regional actors around the Taiwan Straits reacting to that changing security situation? And are there particular evolutions in that response that you think are really notable?
Yeah, thank you very much, David. And allow me to just express my appreciation to Bijan and the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for organizing this very important discussion. And on behalf of GTI, we're pleased to be one of the co-sponsors for this event, and look forward to learning from really esteemed panelists that you have assembled, as well as all the experts that you have today in this room to learn more about Canada's approach to the Indo-Pacific and the synergies that we might be able to discover through our conversations today with regards to U.S., Taiwan, and Canada's security and approaches to countering this really, I think, increasingly aggressive and belligerent PRC activities. And I think as the keynotes have already referenced, as well as Ambassador Young's comments with regards to Xi Jinping's approach to Taiwan and beyond just Taiwan, throughout the region and globally as well, we have certainly seen a far more aggressive China, both militarily, economically, and overall in its political approaches, both in overt and covert forms of political warfare. And I think this has elicited, a very strong reaction, a countervailing reaction in the region that I'm going to talk about briefly here in the limited time that I have. Because if not for, I think, the strong reactions that we've seen from regional countries like Japan, Australia, India, Philippines, and even now South Korea, I think the direction will be in the wrong one. But despite, I think, the deterioration or the more risky environment that we are in, there is a balance of sort. Now, as a result of the actions taken by regional players. And to start, I think it's very notable the transformation that we've seen from Tokyo in particular. Now, it's often said that in the last decade or so, especially under the leadership of the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, there's been a real transformation in that country's approach to security issues in East Asia. Really, it was under his leadership that it began to really reconceptualize Japan's security posture and its position on peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Now, as Steve had already referenced earlier, there's a very long-standing and closeness in cultural and people-to-people ties between Taipei and Tokyo. But the extent of that translating to policies that really help to reorient Tokyo's posture defensively with regards to working in coordination with the United States in far more intimate and close and interoperable form, have really only been, really seen that in the last decade or so, and it is largely due to the fact that of Prime Minister Abe's leadership there, as well in response to, of course, PRC increased military aggression in the East China Sea, and also its economic coercion activities with its restriction of rare earth exports. We may all have remember that episode where essentially the PRC cut off exports of rare earth metals that are essential to primary materials going into high technology manufacturing due to disputes that they had with Japan. Now that's one example, and now to the extent that Japan has clearly indicated with senior leaders' statements that a Taiwan contingency is a Japanese contingency. Anyone with even with a limited knowledge of Japan, that to move that bureaucracy and shift in the direction that it has notably is no small feat, and that required sort of the leadership of I think leaders who can really move there, and I'm glad to see that at least that there's been, despite Prime Minister Abe's unfortunate passing, that policy has continued onwards and in fact has carried on. Now, as I referenced earlier, it's not just Japan that is also transitioning in terms of its approach. Australia, a key security ally of the United States, has also, as a result of its, not only of its alignment with the U.S. security posture in the Indo-Pacific, but also for its own, being its own recipient of Chinese economic coercion, has also realized that it can't depend or rely, excessively on the PRC as its primary export market, which is, for the most case, in most countries, it is. But realizing that that leverage that it gives Beijing was uncomfortable for the political coercion that they utilized it for. So in the case of Canberra, in insisting on an independent investigation of the origins of the COVID pandemic, bore the brunt of these politically imposed embargoes, restrictions of wine and Australian wine. And this is just one of many examples of how many of the types of coercion and threats that Taiwan has faced for decades is now increasingly felt throughout the world, irrespective of just Taiwan. And so I think people understand now as a result that it's not just about Taiwan, right? It's not, if the free world, the international community were to give Taiwan to the PRC, it would not stop there, right? The security situation in East Asia will be even graver and more dire. And because the ambitions, as reflected by the actions that we are increasingly seeing from the PRC, is that it extends beyond just the Taiwan scenario. And I'll just also, in the interest of time, I think reflect on a bit about South Korea, because I think that's really one of the really very transformative relationship in that country's perceptions and towards the security situation in the Taiwan Strait. Now, I think just a few years ago, it would have been unthinkable that the leaders of South Korea and the leaders in Japan would be able to convene in a trilateral senior summit at Camp David to really outline a shared vision, for collective, security, used generally, in Asia, due to, of course, a very long and historical grievances, but because of leadership, in South Korea with the new President Yoon Suk-yeol, and his pro democracy and alliance positions, and his own understanding that democracies need to work closer together. But on top of that, it's also a reaction not beyond just these more sort of abstract ideals, if you will, but for the fact of PRC's own actions taken against it when, for its own defense and security against North Korean provocation, decided to host, missile defense systems there, but then was met with incredible economic coercion activities that, resulted in the use of banning of tourism and the restrictions of, commercial properties use in Korea from Lotte, which hosted, these missile systems in, South Korean sovereign territories, and yet, bore the brunt of, PRC's use of its economic coercion to exact its political concessions, and this resulted in a very, I think, now that wasn't sort of the watershed per se, because over time I think as Chinese ambitions as well as its actions increasingly reveal its true intentions. I think South Korean public attitudes has transformed very, very significantly over just a period of a little over a decade. From being very pro-China in their orientation to now increasingly one of the most negative perceptions, I think trumping that of, South Korean negative attitude towards Japan, which traditionally always held the highest, were the highest. And so that sea change is, I think, profound. And that's not limited just to, the countries I've mentioned, but, throughout the region as well. So I think we're seeing now, a lot of actions taken by countries in the region to balance the threat that the PRC is presenting. And let me just stop there and allow my other panelists to speak as well.
So to build off the theme of evolving perceptions, Brian, over the last 6-7 years, Canada's been much more consistently present in the region, particularly with the Royal Canadian Navy. I guess, how would you observe from that, through that lens, the change in the evolution in the security situation there?
Yeah, I think Eric brings up a really great point when he talks about observing what it is that China says. What are the orders given to their military? I think it's really important for knowledgeable observers to watch closely, to match the trend, to hear what they actually say and watch what they actually do, and to report that up to allow decision makers at the highest levels to make the decisions about where to be and what the priority is and what the objectives are. I think it's really clear that in Canada we were a bit slow to recognize this change in China. I think we were a little naive. I think most Canadians would admit that. Someone referenced John Manthorpe's book, Claws of the Panda. I think it's really clear that if we had watched closely, we would have recognized where this was going a long time ago, and we were a bit slow to it. The Long Game by Rush Doshi is another great book that explains it all, and they go in great depth. He goes into some great depth of just what it is they're saying in Chinese at their highest level meetings and how that policy rolls out. And I think it's matched by a change in the force that they've built. A weaker country builds a force for sea denial to stop a stronger enemy from being able to operate in their area. And that's what China did for a long time. But we can see with their efforts to build aircraft carriers, with their efforts to build a sea control navy and force that would enable an amphibious assault, we can see that change. And it began 15 years ago. We should have foreseen this coming, that as soon as they were able to, powerful enough to build that force, they were going to build it. And that's not saying that they're going to use it, but when you have it, you can use it. And you can change intent anytime you like, but you can't change your force structure anytime you like. That takes a decade or more. To build a sea control navy of the size of the United States or the size that China is building to takes a generation. And they're on their way there now, getting closer all the time. And we should have foreseen that coming because it was really clear we didn't see it. Now, as a serving member of the Canadian Forces, I was never involved in deciding where Canada ought to operate and what we ought to do. And we've always been challenged in Canada to translate national interests through to military strategy. Canada lacks a national security strategy, lacks a published grand strategy. But the Canadian national interests are clear and straightforward. And I think to Russell's point, the Canadian national interests, Minister Freeland spoke about them the day before we put out the last Canadian defense policy. She was really clear. There's, security of Canadians, prosperity of Canadians, rules-based international order. That's clear. And to Russell's point, it's about more than Taiwan. The rules-based international order won't survive in the form we understand it, to the benefit of Canadians and like-minded allies, unless we push back against bullies who would break that. And so obviously it's about more than Taiwan. It's about Canadian national interests beyond just our relationship with Taiwan. Not that that's not important, but it's not just Taiwan. It's about so much more. We could see that. I was in the Strategic Joint Staff and then at our Joint Operational Headquarters, and we were pushing for deployments to places that weren't necessarily being driven yet by the government and by senior policy makers because because we just weren't looking at the China problem. But we always need to be ready for what the government asks us to do, and that meant getting out to the Indo-Pacific earlier. And so we've driven our limited resources to shift towards the Indo-Pacific. But it's difficult because there's only limited resources. You don't want to leave the rest of the world short. You can see, obviously, with what's happening in Ukraine, that NATO is still important to Canada. You can see with what's happening in the Middle East that sending forces to work with Fifth Fleet in the Indo-Pacific, as Admiral Davidson did years and years ago, and as I got to do afterwards. You can see that all of that stuff is still going to be important. But in general, we're shifting towards the Indo-Pacific with more deployments than ever before. And while the government was reluctant and nervous about it the first time, we knew that operating with allies in the most sensitive areas, like Straits of Taiwan transit in company with allies, was going to make a difference. And so Canada was the first nation in a long time to sail with the United States Navy through the Straits of Taiwan transit. And while the government was nervous about it, we made the argument that yes, it sends a signal to China, which is super important, but it also allows us to demonstrate to ourselves and to our allies that we'll be consistent, that we'll be there regularly. That's an important part of deterrence, and that we know how to operate with them in the most difficult of situations in the specific region that matters. It matters understanding the terrain where you might have to fight one day. Even if you don't think you're going to have to fight there, if you're not prepared, if you don't practice it regularly, you certainly won't be ready on the day. I think the most important message is, when it comes to deterrence, is if you want peace, you prepare for war.
So I'm going to ask all of you to build off of that, and Brian, I'll give you a minute to expand a little bit further. So if you're each reflecting on the existing security situation, the desire to maintain an effective deterrent posture, which is a combination of actual material capability as well as signaling and intent and making sure that's understood. If you could each pick one thing, if you had your druthers, that you do to enhance the peace and stability and security of the region, what would that be? And a second question with a view to the wider relations with allies and partners, which I think Taiwan's defense will rely upon. How would you reflect on the experience with the support that the West has provided to Ukraine? I mean, probably a little bit early to assess how things are going with support to Israel, but I think on one hand, that's indicated a lot of resolve, but it's also exposed a lot of limitations in terms of the West's ability to provide material support. If anybody in the room has 155 millimeter ammunition shells to shell the people, I'm sure you'd find a ready buyer. But just as an example of a relatively easy to produce commodity, we've shown a lot of limitations in our ability to spool up industry and provide that. So if you had to pick one thing, what could be done to enhance security for the Straits and the region, and then how would you reflect on the wider kind of alliance and partner dynamics and supporting that? And Brian, I'd give you the first kick at that.
Yeah, thanks. It's a challenging piece. I think because you have to fight. If war were to come today, you have to fight with the force you have. Someone else spoke about it before you. It takes 10 years to, at best, to develop new capabilities and field new capabilities. And so you have to consider what the force you have today. I think the most important thing, as a former member of the Canadian Forces, is clarity in direction from government. That allows planners to be clear and to be strategic and to align all of the elements of national power behind the stated goal. So the goal has to be clear. I appreciated both members of Parliament's discussions today about trying to be the committee recommendations to the government, the clarity requested without being aggressive. There's no point in being grandstanding. We're at most a middle power. So there's no point in grandstanding about this, but clear, calm, steady commitment and presence is going to make a difference. And enabling that through clear language from government would be the single thing I think would be the most quick to do and the most helpful given the force we have today.
Eric?
So in the Air Force, we have a saying that mass and persistence equals victory. And we usually mean that in terms of putting munitions on a target. But in this case, another saying also comes in hand, which is that we prioritize people over platforms. So add these two together and think about like the ways that we can support Taiwan. In this case, it means sending our folks out to Taiwan, seeing the country, looking at the operational environment, dealing with the Taiwan military, doing that en masse, and then being able to that way help Taiwan achieve deterrence in a way that's separate from simply just selling them weapons.
I guess let me take a different approach than my co-panelists, given that they focused on the military side. I would say that the single most important area to bolster deterrence is enhancing Taiwan's national resiliency. And I would say that, in efforts of being able to bolster morale, enhancing its will to fight, there are ongoing civil defense initiatives that I do think it's worth mentioning that Taiwan is undertaking. It's civil society's undertaking, where there are workshops being formed by civil society groups like Kuma Academy or Forward Alliances that are organizing trainings for civilians across the country to be able to help them be more prepared in an emergency response situation, so that people feel more prepared. People feel more ready. They know how to respond in the event of a crisis. It may not necessarily be a military invasion, but those skills that they do acquire and the psychology that it enhances, I think will go a long way in making sure that the government, in its efforts to try to enhance its own deterrent posture in terms of acquisitions of military hardware or development of military hardware, or even military training, making costly trade-off decisions, could find better and stronger support from the population when people are more acclimated to the potential of the threats that they face. So these civil defense initiatives are steps in the right direction, and they need to be I think augmented and accelerated. In addition to that, I would say I would commend also the efforts by from Taiwan to extend its conscription from what was previously just 4 months of services to a full year. Now that I think is a very important effort to be able to ensure that the serving population will be better trained and more ready. And again, it goes a long way into the whole package of its overall efforts for defense reforms, given the fact that, in order to be more prepared and ready for all sorts of contingencies, it needs to have the necessary budget allocations that can help support it. And again, a greater will and a greater sense of national resiliency, the civil defense efforts that are readies the population, steels their sort of psychology for the potential of a military conflict or various types of conflicts, I think would give way to help bolster more public support for important trade-off initiatives that would come about in making sure that Taiwan is better prepared and ready for all sorts of contingencies.
Ambassador?
Well, I love to have a map of Asia behind me when I speak, because I'll say, if you look at the dozen countries that share a border with China, all of them have fractious relations. It's like that kid in 5th grade that was always picking fights, and everybody wondered why he was so aggressive. It's disheartening to me to see China doubling down on its autocratic tendencies and its unwillingness to compromise with its neighbors. My dad and my brother fought in Vietnam, and if we'd known more about what was going on, maybe we could have avoided that war, because it turns out the Vietnamese have been fighting the Chinese for 2,000 years. And it was only, some bad decisions that got us into a war that cost us so much blood and treasure. I do think that absent change in China, the rest of the world, and particularly its neighbors, need to make it clear that it's never going to have full status in the region when it is so belligerent and aggrandizing in its territorial claims. So I think there's a lot that we could hope for. But in the absence of change in China, I think our alliances and our friendships around the region are going to be critical.
I want to shift gears a little bit and have a bit more of a kind of a forward-looking, prognosticating type of view. Russ, I'm going to put you on the hot seat to start first. Between the elections in Taiwan and the elections of various types, including the one to hopefully get a Speaker of the House, in the United States, which do you think will be more impactful to the security situation for Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits? And then I'm going to ask you the same question in a slightly different context, Stephen.
Let me focus on Taiwan. I think it's a little bit less complicated.
Speaker.
So I think in the case of Taiwan, at least of what we've seen from the leading candidates, the KMT, TPP, and DPP, all candidates have committed to maintaining the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. And I think there are less concerns in this election than previous ones about the orientations of some of the leading candidates in their pro-Beijing orientations. Some from sort of more fringe elements of the, some of the political parties that did not represent, I think the mainstream of the major political parties in Taiwan, whereas in, I think the upcoming election in Taiwan, the three major party candidates, including now a fourth that, appears to be intending to, follow through till the end, which is Terry Guo, the Foxconn tycoon. All of which, again, I think the three have committed to maintaining the more sort of traditional policies of their respective political parties. With, the DPP's candidate Lai Ching, the current vice president, committing to following through with the policies of the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, which I think, both certainly within the United States as well as internationally have commended her administration's handling of a very difficult and challenging security situation, as well as domestic situation, in pursuing an approach to cross-strait relations that overall did not challenge any of the traditional framework of the country's approach to Beijing. Similarly, with the KMT's candidate Hou You-yi, who was recently in the United States as well in meetings with leaders there, have similarly indicated a very traditional posture of bolstering defense, Taiwan's defense, and trying to engage. The only distinction is that, I think there is a greater confidence in the part of the KMT to be able to engage Beijing. Now whether that will actually result in meaningful rapprochement is to be seen. I think as Ambassador Young had alluded to, Xi Jinping has moved the goalposts many times already, and with regard, especially with what we've seen in Hong Kong, it's challenging to believe any promises that Beijing makes at this point, even between the KMT and even with the KMT. And thirdly, of course, with the third interesting third-party candidate of the former Taipei City Mayor Ko Wen-je, who positions his policy as sort of in between the DPP and the KMT, does not deviate much from the fundamental policy approaches of the two the two major political parties, the DPP and the KMT. I think this all reflects, I think, the maturity of a democracy that, now with a greater, with the overwhelming part of the population supporting the status quo. In fact, sometimes what gets lost in a lot of the conversations about Taiwan's politics and where it's going is that there's sort of this sense that somehow Taiwan's going to lurch to unification or lurch to independence, when in fact the overwhelming population actually supports maintaining some form of the status quo, with only low single digits of the population supporting either immediate unification or immediate independence. And this is reflected in very consistent polling data that are available by reputable academic institutions in Taiwan. For those of researchers who are interested, I encourage you to look at the National Zhengzhi University to Election Study Center's polling that's done annually, and obviously, being a democracy, there's countless other pollings that are available too, and I encourage you to look at that to really try to understand the trends in public opinion within Taiwan, and why I think we are seeing sort of the convergences of the policies that bodes well, I think, in my view, for cross-strait stability, with the exception of not knowing exactly what Xi Jinping is going to do.
So you mentioned democratic maturity, and you did not answer the part of my question about the United States. I don't know whether or not that was intentional or not. Okay.
What, I'm supposed to tell you who's going to win?
Are you talking about the speaker's race?
No.
Speaker's race next election?
I think they can't. They're going to wait till next year for the speaker. Yeah, these elections are quite important for our interests up here on the panel, because one candidate has expressed strong support for Taiwan and a suspicious attitude toward the PRC, and the other one not so much. I think that it would be wonderful if China would change, but I've been wishing for that for so long that I just wonder what it's going to take. And in the absence of that, I think it's still important, and I think it's very encouraging that all of the neighbors of China have issues with the way China governs itself and its outlandish claims for territory that they belong to. India is a fascinating case because, it has a lot of reason to want to be at the table on all these issues. It has real problems with China, and the bogus claims that the Chinese make on their territory are one of the salient issues which have resulted in low-key clashes, if that's possible to say, but it could flare up again. So barring the liberalization of China that many of us have wished for a long, long time, we just need to make it clear to China that there are rules of the road that they need to follow.
So, Eric, I'm going to ask a slightly different version of the same question that's tied into U.S. politics, which you're free to opine on if you want, but if you want to take a pass, you've got a lot of experience focused on the U.S. support to foreign military sales and basically U.S. government support to supporting allies. Last week, President Biden outlined a very substantive set of intended supports to allies. I think I have the math right of about $100 billion, 60 of it for Ukraine, 10-ish for Israel, 6 for the Indo-Pacific, but tied to Taiwan specifically, and then I forget exactly where the remainder went. I don't know if part of that, Canada also has huge demands on the U.S. foreign military sales system right now for our future fleets and some other things. I guess, do you have a concern as a former practitioner of that? Is there a limit on how much support the U.S. government can execute? So irrespective of what can come from industry, there's a huge effort on the part of the American government to actually support all of that material assistance. Can you maybe offer a comment? And then if you just actually build just slightly, because you're not just doing the sale anymore, there's also other support in the form of training and other forms of assistance. So a bit of a comment about that and the capacity to carry that forward into future years.
Yeah, sure. So first off to note, with Taiwan itself is advanced, very rich society. So up until actually for the last 50 years or so, it's always been in the top three of the U.S. Foreign military sales buyers, right, in the entire globe. Right. So in terms of exhaustion of U.S. government, funds for Taiwan, I don't think that's a major case just because Taiwan itself can afford many of these things. And the big thing right now, of course, are the defense industry bottlenecks that keep the U.S. industry from being able to deliver on already paid for contracts. Right. I think the bigger question here for Taiwan is being able to integrate all these new platforms and to be able to train to the degree necessary to be able to deter their adversary. I think we've seen in the case of the very brave Ukrainians how absolutely difficult it is to be able to work with all the pillars of military power, right, over this last counteroffensive, right? It's not just about putting people in tanks, giving them, a month or two's worth of training, and suddenly they're going to be able to breach some of the, most difficult mine terrain in all of Europe, right? This is training that takes years, decades even, for some of our allies and partners. So being able to start this early, irrespective of platform, is something that would actually benefit Taiwan more than, say, the concerns over how much the U.S. government can be able to sell to Taiwan.
Hey, Dave, can I just add that there's an opportunity here for other countries like Canada? It's not necessarily about foreign military sales just that way, but there are companies that operate in other countries like Canada who could fill capacity gaps if they were freed up. And the way to free them up is just clarity from the government about that process and about that intent in a way that's not belligerent, but that allows the innovation of companies around the world, including Canadian ones, to be involved.
Thanks. So momentarily I'm going to invite folks to come to the mic and open things up for question and answer. And as you're making your way to the microphone, I'm going to ask Brian one last question. So again, forward-looking, feel free to opine on Canadian politics if you want. But you observed, and just to build off that last discussion, it takes a while to not just acquire new equipment, but to then turn that into useful capability, all the training and all the work that has to happen for that to occur. We have a lot of modernization in train from the Canadian Armed Forces. I think I would observe you're probably being optimistic if you're thinking that that will result in new employable capability 10 years from now. So if it's going to be at least a decade before we have a new naval fleet, a lot of modernized air systems, we're going to have to bridge from what we have today at least 10 years into the future if we want to be able to, say, keep sustaining our Indo-Pacific strategy the way that the government has intended, with the deployment of 3 ships being one example. We're sitting here as the government of Canada is wrestling with potential budget cuts, which might impact that. So I guess I'd ask you to comment a little bit about what will be required for the Canadian Armed Forces as they exist today to sustain the type of involvement in the region that we have been committed to as part of our Indo-Pacific strategy for another 10 years minimum.
Yeah, it's a great point. We're all in Canada tracking closely the decisions about belt tightening as the government, looks at deficits and the fiscal situation, and the decision that they would trim $1 billion out of the department's budget, and observers are rightfully concerned. Well, what will the impacts be? You can see the Chief of Defense Staff himself hasn't said what those impacts will be yet, because but they are concerned about it and working their way through to understand what those impacts will be. Personally, from having been responsible for force generating about half of the Canadian Navy's capacity, my first thought was the maintenance budget, national procurement, and so I don't know what part of national procurement will have to pay of that budget trim, but there's legitimate concern because the fleet's old. And the only path to the next fleet in all the services, but the one I know best, of course, is the Navy, the only path to the next fleet is by operating the current fleet at a rate that allows you to gain experiences for sailors and officers who will do the next job. If you want to be good as a junior or an intermediate sailor, you have to have done the job as a junior sailor at sea sufficiently to get good at the next level, and so on up the chain. And so we have to provide opportunities for them. Paradoxically, even if you're stretched, the best way to gain those experiences is to train for and then deploy on real missions, like going to the Indo-Pacific region. And so while it is painful, if you're short resources, to keep doing it, you need to keep doing it at the level you can afford to sustainably do it if you're to keep it going. It's like a sausage machine. You have to keep pushing the meat through the sausage machine, or you won't have any meat when the new sausages are ready.
Okay, with that as a segue, we have about 20 minutes until lunch. Don't know if sausages are part of that menu or not. Invite folks to pose questions. Just ask you to identify who you are and before you do so.
Hi, it's Steve Chase with the Globe and Mail. I have a question about the most likely scenarios you foresee in terms of some kind of attempt to take Taiwan. Everybody talks about invasion. There's a debate about whether Taiwan needs to build up conventional forces or focus on asymmetric warfare. But as a non-expert, it seems to me that this could be over very quickly with a blockade that lasts a long time. There's benefits to being an island, but there's a lot of negatives. We can supply Ukraine from Western Ukraine indefinitely. Taiwan's basically finished in a few weeks if oil runs out and if the submarine cables are cut. So here's my question. I don't see people talking a lot about a blockade as being sort of the most likely and dangerous scenario. And how our allies, it's Taiwan's allies, it has many unofficial allies, how are they supposed to respond to this, and are they ready for this? That's my question.
Who would like to start with that?
I'll take a jump at it, Stephen. I think it's a great question. And by the way, I love your reporting. Keep running with it, please. I do think we are thinking about that blockade question. I do think it comes up. You need, if you want to defend yourself, you need to be able to deny the enemy the ability to use the waters around you. That's sea denial. But if you want to secure your sea lines of communication in order to ensure that you're resupplied, you need sea control assets. So you need both. And it's a false dichotomy to say that the world's changed, based on the Ukraine war and ships don't have a place anymore. I don't believe that's true. Ships have a place in the sea control business. Submarines and mines and drones have a place in the sea denial business. And in order to properly defend against all contingencies, you would have to have both the ability to deny the enemy the use of the water around you and the ability to control it. And so I think your question is important. It's important for allies to consider what capabilities they need and what capabilities they have in a strategy to enable sea control to continue supplying in the event that the enemy decided that a blockade was the right strategy. And you'd need to be able to have sea denial to make that blockade so painful to try to execute that they would decide not to. And it's interesting, the whole deterrence piece, it makes no sense. It would be incredibly hard to invade Taiwan. There's no easy way, just like it was incredibly hard. It would be harder than Russia's role in Ukraine. It would be harder for China to invade Taiwan. And yet, as hard as that was for Russia, they did it anyway. It's impossible for Hamas to win a military conflict against Israel, and yet they did it anyway. And so I think we have to be prepared for both contingencies, even though neither makes any sense for China.
Eric, do you want to comment?
It's actually a lot harder to institute a blockade than it would be, just on paper, right? And then I know our U.S. Navy submariners would just salivate at a chance to get after a PLA blockade, especially given some of the, the features like the Miyako Straits that constrain any ability by the PLA Navy to institute an all-around blockade, right? A blockade also requires time by the Chinese to be able to institute, and that is also the time that would be given to the U.S. and its allies and partners to appropriately mass and determine where best to break a blockade. So there's trade-offs in any scenario, and a blockade isn't a magic weapon for the PLA.
I think the implications of your question is really interesting in the sense that, I think we are sort of very hyper-focused on an all-out invasion scenario, and we're not assessing the full spectrum of potential contingencies that could occur. And as such, being sort of laser-focused in one potential contingency, we may be, losing sight of other potential more likely scenarios. Whether, I think, one thing we do know, at least in terms of what the U.S. intel community has disclosed already, is that, the PRC, Xi Jinping has instructed the PLA to be ready to invade Taiwan in 2027. But obviously capabilities does not equal intention, and that is the more difficult part of the equation to ascertain. But, Taiwan and the United States, as well as like-minded partners and allies, need to be prepared for a full range of contingencies. What I will say in terms of my understanding of what would be implicated in a blockade is that it could quickly spiral into an all-out conflict. And so if Beijing wants to blockade Taiwan, it must be also ready to engage in an all-out, full-on conflict. So that would be a very, I think, also difficult decision to make, even though it could be seen as a more likely scenario than an outright sort of bolt of an invasion of Taiwan. I am more worried of what I see as a potentially more likely scenario than even that of a blockade or an all-out invasion is a more limited conflict in which Beijing has demonstrated time and again that it is willing to accept political costs for the military operations that it takes. And so taking some military operations, perhaps relating to, offshore islands or features in the South China Sea, where, it could be seen to have very little military significance, but for its political objective could be seen as a far more acceptable cost in order to exact the type of political signal and victory that it may want to demonstrate as potentially a more likely scenario in the near future than, say, the other types of contingencies that we are talking about right now.
When I was a boy, my dad was a military advisor to Taiwan, and he went to the offshore islands. And I visited them much later, and I was struck that most of the people on Kinmen and in Matsu say our future's with the mainland because it's a short ferry ride. And I had a government guy with me who kept sort of shrinking with all this stuff. But difficult as it might be, those islands are not an asset. They're a liability for Taiwan. And I still remember the mayor of Matsu saying, our future's with Xiamen, not those guys on the mainland. They call Taiwan the mainland. A couple of other points. The best scenario of all would be change in China, as improbable as that might seem. Other than that, we need to continue the friendships and alliances we have all around East Asia and circling south, where India has no great love for China, and even into Central Asia. The Chinese seem to alienate just about everybody they deal with. Sea denial would be important. And last, because I don't get up to Canada very often, I want to thank you very much for giving us people like Patrice Bergeron and Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, because you've enriched our culture a tremendous amount. And I'm just sorry that Bergeron couldn't bring home the Stanley Cup last year.
Sir.
Jacob Cavalli of Carleton University. Mr. Hsiao Taro, the former prime minister and now deputy leader of the LDP, was in Taiwan 2 days ago. When it comes to Abe Shinzo, he was a great friend of Taiwan. And on the side of Taiwan, of course, the late President Lee Teng-hui insisted on speaking Japanese till the end of his life, lived to be about 95 or 96. The very close relationship between Japan and Taiwan is a fact of historical importance, especially when you consider the relationship between Japan and its other colony that was mentioned by one of the members of this excellent panel. Everything that we think and do in the context of Indo-Pacific goes back to an essay written in English and published in English by Abe on the 27th of December, 2012. If it starts, of course, with a Quad, and then with a return of sorts of Germany and Britain and France to the Indo-Pacific in the military and strategic environment. The essay is called ADSD, Asia's Democratic Security Diamond. With regards to China, I'm constantly at a loss trying to understand why a regime that calls itself communist and it has tens of billionaires, in China almost every single year for the past 7 has been the first nation in the world with the largest number of billionaires. We insist on referring to it as communist when it has every single feature that a fascist regime like that of Germany would qualify in the historical context. I would like to ask the panel to react to my assessment of India because of the great promise that many of us think it has with regards to the capability of democracies to follow what Abe Shinzo said at the end of his seminal essay, how to cope with China. Not to go to war with China, he said, just to balance our interaction with it with trying to push back on its aggressiveness. And that is the fact that India seems to emerge as the head of sorts of the so-called Global South. And on the other hand, it is a full-fledged member of the SCO. The BRICS affiliation of India doesn't bother me too much, but when it comes to the SCO, that is really something that we may want to be considering or reconsidering the role that we would like to see India fulfill as nominally at least the world's largest democracy. And the last thing, please consider free and open Indo-Pacific.net. Thank you.
Who would like to start there?
Well, I mean, I'll go with that one. Okay. Well, I think the India holds out a very important counterweight to the PRC, first as the most populous democracy, and for its shared values with the free world. But as much hope as there is with India fully aligned with the with the free world, there are complexities in India's own foreign policy where it has been stringently non-aligned through much of its own history and continues, despite its greater concerns about PRC military aggression along its own borders, does not appear to be shifting outright in a full alignment. I don't personally expect to see New Delhi fully aligned ever because of its very strategically independent mindset with regard to its position. And this is reflected in position that has taken on, or non-position that has taken on Ukraine and other international issues that reflect the limits of its full alignment with, with the West as well as like-minded nations. And so while I think there is certainly a very constructive and important role for India to play, and I think Japan's, the late Prime Minister was right to point out, the importance of India, and I think, all the like-minded countries and nations must continue to engage New Delhi and encourage it to take on a more constructive role in its own governance, as well as its role in global governance issues, as well as, but there will be, I think, again, limits on its full alignment with the West.
So I think the ironic joy to this is that the CCP under Xi is extremely paranoid. And one of the things that it fears the most is lack of something they call war control, the ability to control a war so that it doesn't threaten the CCP, right? And it's been part of like the PLA's writings over the last 5 years. They're scared of a conflict over Taiwan spreading into a multi-front conflict that includes India. Now, whether or not India would ever sign up to that is completely different, but that perception in China does exist. So whether or not India does cooperate fully with the West, well, China thinks it does.
Okay, I see, I think 3 people. Someone's in and out behind the pole. Yep, 3 people. I want to take all 3 of your questions as a batch. So please do ask that you keep them short, and then we'll pose all 3 of them to the panel.
Okay, André Laliberté, Political Studies at University of Ottawa. Thank you, all of you, for your very good comments. And especially, Russell, you kind of short my question because I was thinking about Canada's deterrence with allies, and certainly Quad is not going to be part of the equation because, as you know, our relationship with India has deteriorated dramatically in the last few weeks. My question, though, it's for all panel members. Why is it that we're not part of AUKUS? Why we don't have a caucus? And that's a tricky question. I'm aware that Canada is having some significant weaknesses in its defense posture. What can we do in a context where the federal government is cutting budgets? Thank you.
And next, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Camille Cournoyer. I'm a nonpartisan intern for the Parliamentary Internship Program. And my question was in reference to the place or the potential of cultural diplomacy as a tool for defense, in the sense that we often frame defense as armed cells, especially in the case of Taiwan, but especially responding to the earlier comments about potentially taking a more holistic approach to studying Taiwan in general, having personally worked with artists who seem very eager to share their music or arts to the global scene. And Canada being a middle power and then needing a clear, calm, and steady strategy, as was mentioned earlier, I was wondering, as I mentioned, the place of cultural diplomacy as a potential tool for defense. Thanks.
And last but not least.
Yeah, Andrew Erskine, young fellow with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. The discussion this morning is focused quite heavily on China, the United States, Canada, and like-minded allies, and rightfully so. But my question for everyone on the panel is, what role would Russia or North Korea have in a potential conflict or in the overall architecture for regional security across the Taiwan Strait? Is this an approach that China could maybe pursue both countries as a way to divert military capabilities away from their conflict with Taiwan, either on the Korean Peninsula or in Eastern Europe?
Okay, 3 good questions, 2 minutes. Short answers. Ambassador, you first.
I have traveled a lot in China, and I've very frequently run into hostility toward Russia. They feel that the Russians stole Siberia from them. I mean, they've got a lot of grievances that go back a long ways. So I think the cooperation between Beijing and Moscow today is fragile. And adept management by the United States and our friends and neighbors in East Asia can help to avoid that from spiraling out of control?
Russell?
I'll take the cultural diplomacy one. I think there's enormous potential for people-to-people ties, with particularly between Canada and Taiwan, where existing frameworks of bilateral relations would not be impugned by the deepening of cultural and people-to-people diplomacy. And I think you're right to highlight the importance of, the arts, music, of, the various elements of culture to be able to deepen understanding of one another, and especially to encourage greater student exchanges. Some of the most promising and long-lasting relationships between the people of the United States and Taiwan came from the people-to-people ties due to the fact that people would go to Taiwan to do their language training, to learn Mandarin, and then these, I think many of the senior analysts of Ambassador Young's generation did much of their language training in Taiwan, and those formed long-lasting bonds and friendship and understanding that persist to the various highest levels of government. And I think those are ways in which have been underutilized, and I think we are approaching a point now where there is a renaissance of sort of considerations about the importance of enhancing people-to-people ties, given the fact that PRC is closing up. And now that is an opportunity that Taiwan, as well as like-minded partners and allies, need to utilize to really help to enhance Taiwan's international participation and its visibility in the world. And I know that we'll get into this conversation perhaps later in the day about diplomacy and the likes, but I do think it is a under-leveraged and underutilized element of strengthening relations that have multiplying effects that are underappreciated.
Thank you. Eric?
I'll address that very last point about North Korea and Russia support for China in a regional conflict over Taiwan. So I think it's important to realize, for both North Korea and Russia, these countries also have agency in that they're not puppets of China. I think they're looking at the current war in Ukraine very closely to see exactly what China's word as a limitless partner of Russia is worth. Right? It's good for propaganda, not good for much else, apparently. So I think this is going to be something that Russia especially will keep in mind. Even in North Korea's case, it's fascinating for me to see just how powerless China is to affect the overall relationship between North Korea and Russia. I don't think China is very happy about the fact that suddenly North Korea will be getting better access to Russian technology and Russian arms, right? It can't keep it quite as dependent on China as it used to. So it's interesting for me to see how these countries, while nominally aligned with each other and ideologically sympathetic with each other, have very obvious fissures and personality issues that if there is, God forbid, any regional conflict, we'll probably see much more of the same too.
Okay, and Brian, it's to you to opine on the prospect for turning AUKUS into caucus.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a challenge. AUKUS matters, and I think people involved in defense and security in Canada have said and noted that with the formation of AUKUS, there are things that were done at the Five Eyes level that are now done at the AUKUS level, and so we're just not because they're trying to exclude us, just because they're busy and they're doing things at the AUKUS level and they don't want to repeat themselves and get after it. And so we're certainly less involved, thanks to AUKUS. I was in Rhode Island at the U.S. Navy's CNO conference the day AUKUS was announced. I was with the commander of the Navy and a bilat with the commander of the French Navy Navy that day, and I got to tell you, it was worse for them than us that day for sure. So as bad as I felt for Canada, I felt worse for others for sure. But AUKUS matters. What's the right strategy? It's not about belonging to a club and about feeling good as part of the club. And so if that's the sort of the attitude that comes forward, then we're heading in the wrong direction, and nobody should feel sorry for us. And that's not important. What's important is that we share values and interests with those allies, and we've traditionally worked well together, and we need to continue to reinforce that we share those values and those interests, and that we have valuable investment and input to add, and so it's in their interests to include us in as much as possible. And AUKUS, of course, is about more than just submarines. The Canadian submarine replacement project is not looking at a nuclear version of a submarine, so we're not going to do that part of it, but there's a whole bunch more to AUKUS that Canada could be involved in, that Canada could add value in, as long as we are clear about it and strategic about our investments. And so my thinking is that we should be clear about where we share values and interests, and clear about where we're going to invest, and communicate that, and then we'll be just fine.
Okay, everyone, I don't know if Bijan's going to come up. No, he told me I'm able to release you directly to lunch, which I will do after you join me in thanking the panel. And lunch is ready now in the hallway.